He saved a freezing Apache girl with his only blanket. What happened next wasn't kindness. It was a life-changing trap. Watch closely, tell us where you're watching, and don't forget to subscribe if you love stories that hit deep. Now, let's dive in. The winter wind carved jagged patterns across the barren plateau, slashing like a whip at my face and gnawing through my worn leather gloves. I'd been riding hard for days, chasing a deadline none of us in this god-forsaken land cared about. The cold was a predator out here, silent, ruthless, and relentless. I wasn't a man to turn back, not now. Not after what I'd seen. It was just before dusk when I spotted her, a figure crumpled against a jagged rock, a pitiful shape barely clinging to life. At first, I thought she was a stray animal, a coyote or maybe a fox caught in the merciless grip of the storm. But as I drew nearer, the outline hardened into a human form, a young woman, shivering violently beneath a threadbare dress that did nothing to fight the bone-deep chill. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, lips cracked and blue from frostbite. She had the look of someone who'd given up, that distant stare that marks the moment the body starts shutting down. I dismounted wordlessly, the gravity of the situation pressing on me like a boulder on my chest. This wasn't just some lost traveler. This was a death sentence walking. I didn't hesitate. The only thing I could think to do was to give her what little warmth I had left. That blanket, thick, faded, a hand-woven relic from my grandmother, was my most precious possession. I had wrapped myself in it on countless cold nights, each thread stitched with memories of better days. I pulled it loose and wrapped it around her shaking shoulders. Her eyes opened then, dark, sharp, but empty of fear. Instead, they held something heavier, resignation. She didn't speak English, but her fingers clutched the blanket as if it was the last thing keeping her tethered to life. We huddled behind a rock out of the wind, and I built a fire with trembling hands, offering her what scraps of food I carried. She took it slowly, watching me with the intensity of someone trying to memorize every scar, every wrinkle, every ounce of humanity in this stranger. She whispered a name I couldn't understand, but it sounded like a promise. Iona. I spent the night staring into that fire, watching the storm rage beyond our fragile shelter. Every flicker of the flames was a reminder of the line I'd crossed, helping a stranger in a land where kindness was often paid for in blood. I hoped, foolishly maybe, that this was just a passing moment, an act of mercy with no strings attached. But dawn shattered that hope. When she stood and folded the blanket with care, offering it back, I shook my head. The cold was gone for me, but it was still her life on the line. I couldn't take it back. Her eyes widened in shock, then urgency. Words poured out fast, her hands weaving a language I didn't know but felt the weight of like a stone in my gut. I rode away, telling her to stay warm, but the chill clung to me long after the trail swallowed her silhouette. That's when the trouble began. The blanket was no mere cloth to her people. It was a bond, a claim, a marriage. And suddenly, I was bound in a way I never expected. The wild lands I'd roamed alone, the rules I'd lived by, all blurred under the heavy weight of an ancient tradition that didn't care about my ignorance or my intentions. I arrived at the trading post by afternoon, my mind still tangled in the last night's encounter. The fire's warmth inside was a jarring contrast to the cold reality outside. The men there eyed me with suspicion, whispers threading through the smoke-filled room. Apache sightings had spooked them, and now I carried a secret I wasn't ready to share. A grizzled man named Murphy offered coffee and a warning. Drums had been heard in the hills, signs of trouble. That rhythmic beating echoed through the valley, a haunting pulse that felt like a heartbeat of something ancient and unforgiving. I knew then that my choice to help a dying woman had pulled me into a world I barely understood, a world where the kindness I'd shown could cost me everything. Because when the drums call, it's not just a warning, it's a summons, and I was the one being called. The trading post was a cramped little outpost carved out of rough timber and stone, standing like a stubborn scar against the wilderness. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a thin line of warmth reaching into the biting cold outside. Inside, the warmth wrapped around me like a second skin, but the chill inside my mind refused to fade. The men gathered around the table were no friends, just fellow survivors of the unforgiving frontier, roughened by whiskey and suspicion. Their eyes flicked toward me like hawks sizing up prey. Murphy, the grizzled veteran with a face weathered by too many winters, kept one hand near his rifle, a silent warning that this wasn't a place for fools. The talk turned quickly to the Apache. Their presence near the valley was stirring fear, whispers of raids and bloodshed creeping through the dry timber like wildfire. I swallowed the bitter coffee, its warmth a poor substitute for the cold not tightening in my gut. The drums started again just then, a slow, steady beating that rose from the hills like a call from the past. It wasn't random noise but a pattern, an ancient language spoken in rhythm and pulse. The room fell silent, every man listening with a mix of dread and respect. Some edged closer to their weapons. Others stared out the windows into the growing dusk. Murphy said it plainly, when the drums sound, trouble follows. That much I knew from every story I'd ever heard, every caution whispered in saloons and around campfires. I tried to push thoughts of Iona from my mind, the shivering girl wrapped in my grandmother's blanket. Had she survived the night? Was she safe? But those eyes haunted me, dark and intense, like they held secrets I wasn't ready to face. The men didn't ask about her. They didn't understand. They only saw the danger, the potential for violence. And I was caught between two worlds, neither of which I fully belonged to. I took the offer of a room, grateful for the chance to rest, but sleep was a stranger. The drums beat closer now, the sound slipping through the cracks of the walls, wrapping around me like a shadow. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, every instinct screaming that I was being watched. Outside, the trees shifted and whispered in the wind. Shadows moved not like animals, but like hunters closing in. When dawn bled into the sky, the silence was thick and unnatural. The absence of birdsong, the frozen stillness, it was a warning written in the language of the land. Murphy was already outside, rifle in hand, eyes scanning the tree-line with hard suspicion. He said the watchers were close, unseen but felt, like ghosts in the mist. I saddled my horse with deliberate calm, knowing panic would be my enemy. Whatever was coming, hiding was no longer an option. The trail ahead lay like a knife's edge through the valley, flanked by trees heavy with frost and silence. My horse's hooves echoed loudly, each step a drumbeat of its own. Then they appeared, 7 figures slipping from the woods like living shadows. Warriors painted for battle, their faces calm and unreadable beneath war paint and beads. They did not charge or shout. They simply stood in the trail, silent sentinels blocking the way forward. I reached instinctively for my gun, but something stopped me. These weren't raiders or bandits looking for blood. Their bearing was formal, ceremonial even, something ancient beneath the surface. An older man stepped forward, his shirt adorned with beadwork that caught the pale light of morning. He raised a hand, a silent command to halt. Time seemed to slow. The air was thick with expectation, the kind that grips a man's throat and leaves no room for doubt. Then she emerged from behind them, Iona. The blanket was draped over her shoulders, no longer just fabric, but a symbol heavier than any rifle. Her eyes met mine, and in them I saw something I hadn't expected: responsibility. The old man spoke in a tongue I didn't understand, but the words carried authority. Iona translated, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "He says my grandfather claims you have taken me as your wife. The words struck me like a bullet fired from a distance I couldn't reach. Marriage. I had given her the blanket out of kindness, out of desperation to keep her alive. Never did I imagine that act would bind me to a tradition older than the stones beneath our feet. Iona's words echoed in my mind. In their culture, giving a blanket was more than charity. It was a claim, a promise of protection and provision, a binding contract written in wool and honor. I wanted to deny it, to explain myself. But the faces around me were stern, unwavering. The old man, whom Iona called Nish, looked at me with the piercing gaze of a man who had lived through countless winters and judged many souls. He asked if I would have given the blanket to a man of their tribe. The question cut deeper than any knife. Could I honestly say yes? The truth lay heavy in my chest. I probably wouldn't have. Nish nodded as if he already knew the answer. He said honor is shown not just in words, but in actions. By saving Iona, I had accepted a responsibility I hadn't sought. The younger warriors shifted, restless and dangerous, their hands hovering near weapons. The choice before me was clear: honor this unexpected bond or face the consequences that came with breaking it. Iona stood proud but fearful, caught between her world and mine. The path ahead was no longer my own, and for the first time in a long time, I was a man without an easy way out. The canyon air was thin and biting as the early sun cast pale light over the rocky walls. I sat astride my horse, heart pounding like the drumbeats still echoing faintly from the hills, each beat a reminder that nothing here was simple. Nothing was ever simple when ancient customs tangled with the harsh reality of survival. I hadn't signed up for this. I was a drifter, a man shaped by the unforgiving trails and the cold bite of loneliness. But now, beneath the weight of a faded blanket and a promise I never meant to make, I found myself a pawn in a game older than any law I'd known. Iona rode beside me, her expression unreadable, wrapped in the very cloth that had sealed my fate. I could feel the eyes of the warriors behind us, watchful, patient, and dangerous. They were not just escorts. They were judges, witnesses to a bond one barely understood. The village ahead was nestled between red cliffs like a secret carved from the earth itself. Smoke spiraled from dozens of fire pits, children's laughter echoing faintly, a fragile normalcy in a world that seemed anything but. As we rode in, faces appeared, some curious, others hardened by suspicion. I was a stranger in a place where every glance held judgment, where every step was measured against traditions I'd only heard whispers of. Nish led us to the heart of the village, a clearing dominated by a large fire pit surrounded by logs arranged like a council chamber. The elders gathered, their faces a tapestry of age and authority, eyes sharp as obsidian, measuring me with a weight I couldn't escape. Imola, the elder woman with silver hair braided with turquoise beads, stepped forward. Her gaze cut through me like a blade, cold and unyielding. She spoke rapidly to Nish, her voice carrying the anger of a family insulted and a community at risk. Iona translated with a heavy heart. I had brought shame by accepting gifts from a stranger, one who smelled of whiskey and violence. The words hung in the air, thick with accusation and worry. The crowd murmured, tension rising like a storm on the horizon. A young man stepped forward, Kuruk, his eyes dark with jealousy and hostility. He had asked for Iona's hand many times, only to be denied. Now, he saw an opportunity. His words, rough and laced with threat, branded me a liar and a thief. He warned me to leave or face the consequences, a knife to silence my tongue. The village held its breath. Violence was close to breaking loose, a powder keg waiting for a spark. But Imola, with a strength that commanded respect, intervened. She silenced Kuruk and turned her disappointment toward Iona. The choice was laid bare, prove my intentions through the marriage trials, or accept Kuruk's proposal instead. I felt the weight of all those eyes, the pressure of ancient customs pressing down on me. The trials were no mere formality. They were tests of strength, wisdom, and sacrifice, designed to weed out the unworthy and protect the honor of the tribe. Iona's voice trembled as she explained, but there was steel beneath the fear. The first test would come at sunset, the others to follow. Failure was not an option, not without risking more than just my pride. Nish spoke with finality, granting Kuruk permission to hunt me down should I try to escape before completing the trials. The reality hit me like a freight train. I was bound by more than a blanket. I was bound by blood and honor, by traditions I could neither flee nor fight with bullets. But as I looked at Iona, standing tall despite the storm around her, I found a flicker of resolve. She was worth fighting for, worth understanding, worth risking everything. That night, the village transformed. The fire's glow turned shadows into specters, and the air thrummed with anticipation. I steeled myself for what lay ahead, knowing that these trials would not only test my body but also the limits of my spirit. The sun dipped below the canyon rim as I tightened my grip on the rope Nish handed me, the symbol of the first trial. The sacred cliff face loomed above, jagged and unforgiving. To climb it meant risking death. To fail meant dishonor, and a fate worse than death. I looked up, muscles taut and breath steady, as the village gathered to watch. Kuruk's sneer burned in my memory, but I pushed it aside. This was no longer about pride. It was about survival, about respect, about a promise made under cold stars that I couldn't take back. The rope bit into my hands as I began the ascent. Every hold a battle, every inch gained a small victory against the rocky face and the gnawing fear beneath. Behind me, the village watched in silence, some with hope, others with doubt. But I wasn't climbing for them. I was climbing for Iona, for the woman whose life I'd touched, and whose fate had become entwined with mine. As the wind tore at my clothes and the stones threatened to give way, I knew this was only the beginning. The trials would test everything I was. And by dawn, the path I chose would change the course of us all. The cliff face towered above me like a wall built by the earth itself to keep the unworthy out. Its jagged edges caught the fading light of the sun, casting long, sharp shadows that seemed to mock my every move. The village was silent, a collective breath held tight in the cold air, waiting for what would come next. My hands gripped the rough rope Nish had given me, the fibers biting into my skin with every pull. The first trial wasn't just a test of muscle, it was a test of will, an ancient rite meant to separate those who belonged from those who didn't. I started climbing, every muscle straining, my breath coming hard and fast in the thinning air. The rope swayed beneath me, and the cold wind whipped against my face, threatening to steal my grip and send me plummeting down into the rocky abyss below. I could feel the eyes of the village pressing on me from below, their silence heavier than any shout. Halfway up, my legs burned, my hands blistered, but I forced myself to keep moving. The eagle's nest waited at the top, a small cluster of twigs and feathers nestled precariously on a ledge. Retrieving a feather from it would mean passing the test, proving I was worthy. But it wasn't just the physical challenge that threatened me. It was the knowledge that failure would bring shame not only upon me but upon Iona, and that the consequences would ripple through the village like a sudden storm. I thought back to the night I found her, freezing and alone, and the moment I wrapped her in my grandmother's blanket. That simple act, filled with nothing but kindness, had now become a chain I couldn't break. As I neared the ledge, loose stones shifted beneath my boots, sending small avalanches of grit tumbling into the void. My heart hammered in my chest like a frantic drumbeat, mirroring the rhythm that had haunted me since arriving in the village. Finally, I reached the nest. It was smaller than I'd imagined, but the single feather lying within seemed to hold the weight of the sky itself. I plucked it carefully, the soft strands brushing against my calloused fingers. The descent was harder than the climb. Gravity tugged at me mercilessly, each step requiring careful calculation. The rope slipped in places, forcing me to clutch tighter and control every movement with trembling precision. When my boots finally touched the ground, a cheer rose from the village. It wasn't loud or boisterous, but carried a quiet approval that settled deep inside me. I had passed the first trial. Iona's eyes met mine, and for the first time, there was a spark of relief between us. A silent acknowledgement that this journey was far from over, but I wasn't alone. That night, the village gathered around the fire once again. The flames cast flickering shadows on faces marked by hope, fear, and the weight of tradition. Nish approached me with a carved wooden object, a symbol of wisdom, the key to the second trial. He spoke words I couldn't understand, but Iona's voice carried their meaning. The trial of wisdom would test not only my knowledge but my ability to see beyond the surface, to understand the spirit of their people. The elders presented me with a riddle, wrapped in metaphor and history, a puzzle that had confounded many before me. I studied the carvings, traced the symbols with my fingers, and let the silence of the village press in around me. It wasn't just about the answer. It was about respect, patience, and the willingness to learn. As I worked through the challenge, I felt the eyes of the past upon me, the ancestors whose lives and stories shaped every stone, every tree, every breath of wind in this canyon. Hours passed in quiet contemplation. My thoughts circled like hawks hunting prey, searching for the meaning hidden beneath the layers of words and symbols. When I finally spoke the answer, the village was silent for a heartbeat before a ripple of acceptance spread through the crowd. Iona's smile was faint but genuine. I had passed the second trial. But the third, the trial of sacrifice, loomed ahead like a shadow darker than night. Its meaning was clear: to give up something precious, to show true commitment not through words, but through loss. I didn't yet know what that sacrifice would be, but I could feel its weight pressing down on me even now. The days stretched thin as the village watched, waiting for what I would do next. And somewhere beneath it all, I realized that this journey was no longer just about me. It was about two worlds colliding, about a promise made in the cold, about a life I had saved, and a life that now depended on mine. The firelight flickered against the worn faces of the elders gathered in the circle, their eyes piercing, unreadable as ancient stone. I sat cross-legged on the cold earth, the carved wooden tablet resting heavy in my hands like a weight I couldn't shake. This wasn't just an object. It was a test, a challenge to prove that I could see beyond the obvious, that I could understand the spirit of a people whose world was as different from mine as the sun from the moon. Iona sat nearby, her gaze steady and quiet, as if she, too, felt the gravity of this moment. The villagers had gathered, whispers falling silent as the second trial began. I could feel the tension thickening the air, like the storm before a long-awaited rain. The carved symbols on the tablet were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Twisting vines, animals woven into patterns, shapes that seemed both familiar and alien. Nish had said this was a riddle, a test of wisdom and insight that had stumped many before me. I traced the symbols with a trembling finger, trying to find meaning not just in the shapes, but in the spaces between them. The villager's breath seemed to hold with mine, waiting to see if this outsider could grasp their sacred language. The elders spoke softly in their tongue, their words like music I couldn't understand, but Iona translated slowly, carefully, with a reverence that made my heart ache. The riddle told a story, of a river that never flows, of a fire that does not burn, of a bird that cannot fly. The answer wasn't obvious. It wasn't something you could simply guess or learn. It was a truth hidden beneath layers of meaning. I remembered the endless nights on the trail, watching stars wheel overhead, the silent language of the wilderness around me. I thought of Iona, her strength, her silence, the heavy responsibility she bore as both a daughter of her tribe and a bridge to mine. Hours slipped by as I wrestled with the riddle, the pressure mounting like the heat from the fire. My mind raced and faltered, circling around ideas and possibilities. Failure here wouldn't just mean shame. It would be a breaking point for us both, a crack in the fragile hope that bound me to this place. Then, as the moon rose high and the village sat waiting, it came to me. The river that never flows was a path in the mind, the fire that doesn't burn was knowledge, and the bird that cannot fly was the spirit grounded by wisdom. The riddle was about understanding what cannot be seen, about the unseen forces that shape a people's lives. I spoke the answer aloud, my voice steady but soft, unsure if I had reached the truth or merely grasped at shadows. The circle of faces stared back at me, silent at first. Then, slowly, the elders nodded, a subtle but unmistakable sign of acceptance. Iona's eyes shone with a quiet pride, relief melting the tension that had gripped her features. But even as the village began to murmur with tentative hope, my mind turned to the third trial, the trial of sacrifice. It was the one that loomed largest in my thoughts, a shadow darker than any night. I knew it wouldn't be easy. Sacrifice meant more than giving up comfort or pride. It meant offering something precious, something that could not be reclaimed. It was a test of my heart as much as my will. The next day, whispers swirled through the village like leaves caught in the wind. The young warriors eyed me with suspicion, while the elders watched silently, their judgment hidden behind calm expressions. Kuruk, the man who had threatened me with violence, prowled the edges of the village like a predator waiting for a chance. His hatred was clear, a flame I couldn't extinguish. Iona remained my quiet anchor, her presence a reminder of what was at stake. That evening, as the sun bled red behind the cliffs, Nish approached me with a leather pouch, its contents clinking softly. "This is the trial of sacrifice," Iona said, her voice steady but carrying the weight of what was to come. The pouch held sacred objects, tokens of the tribe's history and honor. To complete the trial, I would have to give up something that represented a part of myself, something that showed true commitment. I thought of the blanket, the worn wool woven by my grandmother's hands, a symbol of my past and my promise. But was that enough? Would the village accept a gesture born of kindness, but heavy with unintended meaning? The night stretched long as I wrestled with the decision. I could feel the weight of every eye in the village, every heartbeat waiting for my choice. In the stillness, I realized that this sacrifice wasn't just about losing something. It was about choosing what mattered most, about accepting responsibility not just for myself, but for Iona and the life that now connected us. When I finally made my choice, I knew there was no turning back. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and the unknown. But for the first time, I felt the stirrings of hope beneath the fear. The trials had begun, but the real journey was just unfolding. The dawn broke slow and grey, the canyon wrapped in a heavy silence that pressed down like a stone on my chest. The fire from the night before had died to embers, and the village stirred awake with cautious energy. Today was the day of the final trial, the trial of sacrifice, and every breath I took was weighed down by the gravity of what it meant. I sat outside my small lodging, the worn blanket folded neatly beside me, its faded blue and grey stripes a silent reminder of the promise I'd made. But today, the blanket was not enough. The trial demanded more, a true sacrifice that would prove I was willing to give up something precious, something that could never be reclaimed. Nish approached slowly, the leather pouch in his hands now empty but for one small, sharp object wrapped carefully in cloth. His face was unreadable, carved by years of tradition and responsibility. He motioned for me to follow, and I rose, feeling the eyes of the entire village upon me. The weight of their expectations was a cloak heavier than any winter coat. We walked together to the center of the village, where a fire pit awaited, its circle of stones dark and cold. The villagers gathered in a tight ring around the clearing, men, women, children, all watching silently as the trial was about to begin. Iona stood beside me, wrapped in the blanket I had given her, her dark eyes steady but full of unspoken fears. I could feel her heart beating against mine, a tether that grounded me even as uncertainty swirled like a storm. Nish spoke in his native tongue, his voice low but commanding. Iona translated, her English clear but heavy with meaning. The trial of sacrifice demands you give something precious not for yourself, but for the tribe. Only through this act can honor be secured and peace maintained. The crowd held its breath. I looked down at the small object Nish handed me, a ceremonial knife, its blade sharp and gleaming in the morning light. The cold metal felt alien in my hand, a tool of tradition that carried a weight I could barely comprehend. The choice lay before me, to offer blood, to prove my commitment in the most ancient way the tribe knew. I thought of my life, the freedom of the open trail, the loneliness I had carried like a shadow. But more than that, I thought of Iona, the girl who had trusted a stranger with her life, who had become my link to a world I had barely understood. I had a choice to make, to back down and face the consequences of dishonor, or to face the trial and risk losing something deeper than flesh. As the sun rose higher, painting the canyon walls with gold and fire, I knelt by the fire pit. The villagers watched in silence, their faces a mixture of hope and dread. Nish guided my hand, steadying the knife as I made a shallow cut across my palm. The pain was sharp but brief, the blood warm and vivid against the cold earth. I offered the blood to the fire, a gesture heavy with meaning and respect. The flames licked the scarlet droplets, as if accepting the sacrifice. A murmur ran through the crowd. Iona reached out, taking my hand gently, her fingers warm against mine. Her eyes searched mine, and in that moment I knew this trial was about more than blood. It was about trust, honor, and the fragile bridge between two worlds. The elders nodded solemnly, their approval a heavy gift. But the trial was not yet complete. Nish spoke again, his words echoing through the clearing. You must give what you value most, not in words, but in action. I looked at the blanket draped over Iona's shoulders, the symbol of our bond. My grandmother's weaving, the warmth that had saved a life. Could I give that away? Could I truly surrender a part of myself for this tribe and for Iona? The village waited. The moment stretched. With a steady breath, I removed the blanket and folded it carefully. I held it out to Nish, offering it to the tribe. Silence. Then, a slow ripple of acceptance. Iona's eyes shone with tears, not of sorrow, but of gratitude and hope. Kuruk, who had watched from the edges with clenched fists, stepped back, his anger cooled by the undeniable truth of my sacrifice. That day, I learned that sacrifice was not just about pain or loss. It was about the courage to give something true and unbreakable, something that forged bonds beyond words and weapons. As the sun sank behind the cliffs and the village gathered for a final ceremony, I felt the weight of the past lift slightly from my shoulders. The trials were over, but the journey was far from done, because in the silence after sacrifice, the echoes of choice ripple forward. And sometimes, the hardest battles are the ones we fight within ourselves. The sun dipped low behind the jagged cliffs, bathing the canyon in a warm amber glow that seemed to soften the hard edges of the world around me. But inside, the weight of what I had done, of the sacrifice I'd made, pressed heavy like a stone tied to my chest. The villagers had accepted me, their nods and quiet acknowledgments sealing a fragile peace. Iona's gaze, once filled with uncertainty, now held something like trust. Yet beneath that fragile calm, a storm brewed, one I could feel in the sharp glances cast my way, in the tight lines around Nish's eyes, and in the restless pacing of Kuruk. Honor was a powerful thing here, woven deep into every word, every action, every breath. But honor could also be a blade, cutting as easily as it protected. That night, the village gathered around the fire pit for a ceremony unlike any I'd ever witnessed. Faces lit by flickering flames stared into the darkness, eyes reflecting stories older than memory. The elders spoke in their language, voices rising and falling like a chant, calling on ancestors and spirits to witness the bond forged this day. I stood beside Iona, the blanket still draped over her shoulders like a mantle of both warmth and duty. I felt exposed, as if every secret I'd buried under years of wandering was suddenly laid bare beneath the gaze of 1,000 invisible watchers. As the ceremony unfolded, Kuruk stepped forward, his voice cutting through the night like a knife. "He has taken what is not his," he spat, eyes blazing with fury. "He is a stranger, a white man who does not understand our ways. He dishonors us all." The crowd stirred, some nodding, others watching with wary silence. I knew then that acceptance was a fragile thing, that beneath the surface, tensions simmered, ready to ignite. Iona's hand found mine, a small anchor in the growing storm. Her eyes met mine, fierce and determined. We were bound now, not just by the blanket or the trials, but by something deeper. A fragile thread weaving two worlds together. In the days that followed, the village shifted uneasily. The young warriors eyed me with suspicion, and the elders met in quiet councils I was not part of. The trials had proven my strength and honor, but they had not erased the scars of history. One evening, as I sat by the fire alone, Nish approached. His face was grave, the lines etched deeper by worry. "There are those who do not accept this union," he said quietly. "Kuruk and his followers plan to challenge you. They see this marriage as a threat to their place in the tribe." I felt a cold dread settle in my gut. Violence was never far here, and I knew that the peace I'd earned was precarious at best. "What kind of challenge?" I asked. Nish looked away, reluctant. "A fight for honor," he said simply. "A contest to prove who is worthy of Iona's hand. If you lose, the consequences will be severe." The thought of fighting Kuruk, a man bred and raised in this land, was terrifying. But I could not back down, not now, not after all that had been risked. Iona found me later, her expression fierce but tinged with fear. "This is our world, Boone," she said softly. "You have entered it willingly, but it will test you in ways you cannot imagine." I nodded, knowing she was right. The night before the challenge, I lay awake listening to the sounds of the village, the crackling fire, whispered prayers, the distant howl of wolves. My thoughts raced, circling around the path that had led me here, from a cold canyon where I found a young woman dying, to this place where honor and blood intertwined. I was no longer just a cowboy. I was something more. And the choices I made now would shape not only my fate, but the fate of everyone I cared about. The dawn came too quickly, a pale light filtering through the trees. The village gathered once more, the air thick with anticipation and tension. Kuruk stood across from me, his eyes cold and hard, a warrior ready to fight for what he believed was rightfully his. There was no ceremony this time, no words, only the raw truth of steel and flesh. I tightened my grip on my rifle and stepped forward, heart pounding like a war drum. This was the moment where everything would be tested. The promises, the sacrifices, the fragile bond between two worlds. And as the first light touched the canyon walls, I prepared to face the fight that would determine not just who won Iona's hand, but whether peace could truly exist here. The first light of dawn crept through the canyon like a quiet thief, stealing away the shadows that had cloaked the night. The village stirred with a restless energy, a mixture of hope, fear, and the bitter anticipation of violence. Today, everything would change. Kuruk stood across the clearing, his eyes narrowed with hard resolve, muscles coiled like a predator ready to strike. His followers circled behind him, their faces etched with loyalty and rage, while the villagers watched in silent tension, waiting to see if peace would be shattered or preserved. I could feel Iona's gaze on me, steady and unwavering, though I knew beneath her calm was a storm of fear. This was not just a fight for her hand. It was a battle for the fragile bridge between our worlds, for the promises and sacrifices that had brought me here. My heart pounded, echoing through my chest like the war drums I'd heard earlier in the mountains. Every moment felt stretched and fragile, hanging in the balance between violence and understanding. I tightened my grip on my rifle, the cold metal a familiar weight against my skin. But this was no ordinary fight. The rules were older than the land itself. Honor and skill, not just strength or firepower, would decide the outcome. Kuruk stepped forward, voice low and sharp. If you win, you prove your place here. If you lose, you and the white woman leave. No more lies, no more shame. I nodded, accepting the terms. There was no room for doubt, no path backward. The elders stepped aside, and the crowd formed a wide circle, their eyes burning with intensity. Kuruk drew his knife with a slow, deliberate motion, the blade catching the early light. I set my rifle aside, knowing this was a test of close combat, a skill I had to rely on, despite my better knowledge of guns. The air was thick with tension as we circled, the dust swirling at our feet like spirits awakening. The first move was quick. Kuruk lunged with his knife, a flash of steel aimed for my side. I dodged, feeling the rush of air as the blade passed too close. My own fist found its mark, striking his shoulder, but the man was fast, twisting away with the grace of a seasoned warrior. The fight was brutal, raw, and unrelenting. Every strike and parry echoed the weight of generations, the clash of two worlds locked in a struggle for survival and respect. Kuruk fought with the fury of a man defending not just honor, but a way of life threatened by outsiders. His moves were precise, born of years spent in the wilds, shaped by the unforgiving land. I countered with instinct and determination, drawing on every ounce of strength and skill I had. The years on the trail, the harsh winters and endless rides, had hardened me, but this was unlike any battle I had faced. The crowd watched, breath held, as the fight stretched on. Sweat and blood mingled in the dust, the line between victory and defeat blurred with every strike. Then, in a moment that felt both sudden and inevitable, Kuruk faltered. A misstep, a flash of hesitation, and I saw my chance. I disarmed him, sending the knife spinning into the dirt. For a heartbeat, the world held still. Kuruk looked up at me, eyes blazing with fury and disbelief. But then something shifted. A grudging respect flickered in his gaze. I extended a hand, a silent offer not just of mercy, but of peace. The crowd exhaled, tension breaking like a dam. Kuruk took my hand, gripping it firmly, sealing a bond that went beyond words. Iona stepped forward, a smile breaking through her worry, a light in the shadows that had haunted us both. But even as the village celebrated, I knew this was only the beginning. The trials had tested me, the duel had proven my strength and honor, but the true challenge lay ahead. Bridging two worlds meant more than rituals and battles. It meant understanding, sacrifice, and the courage to face not just enemies, but ourselves. In the days that followed, Iona and I worked to build trust, not just between us, but within the village. We shared stories, meals, and moments of quiet reflection, slowly weaving a fragile tapestry of hope. Yet, old wounds ran deep. Some villagers still watched me with suspicion, and whispers of dissent lingered in the shadows. Kuruk, now an uneasy ally, reminded me that respect was earned, not given. His warnings were a constant reminder that peace was a fragile thing in a land shaped by hardship and survival. One evening, As the sun dipped below the horizon, Iona and I stood at the edge of the village, watching the stars emerge like scattered embers. She turned to me, her voice soft but firm. "This is only the beginning, Boone. Our lives are bound now, but so are the futures of our people." I nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle in my soul. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and the unknown. But I was no longer a lone rider on the trail. I was part of something larger, a story woven by blood, sacrifice, and the enduring strength of honor. As the night deepened, I vowed to face whatever came with the same courage that had brought me here, to stand not just for myself, but for Iona and the fragile hope we shared. Because in a world shaped by fire and ice, the greatest battles were fought not with weapons, but with hearts willing to understand and souls brave enough to change. The first pale light of dawn crept slowly over the jagged canyon walls, casting long, trembling shadows on the dusty ground. The village was quiet, but beneath that stillness lay a tension so thick it seemed to choke the air itself. Today, the fate of many would be decided by the clash of wills, a duel that wasn't just about a woman's hand, but about the fragile, volatile bridge between two very different worlds. Kuruk stood at the edge of the clearing, his frame taut with silent fury and years of unspoken grievances. His dark eyes, like chips of flint, locked onto mine, burning with the fury of a man who had lost too much to trust easily. Behind him, his loyal followers gathered, their faces painted with war symbols, their bodies coiled like springs, ready to explode into violence at a moment's notice. Across the circle, villagers gathered in a wide ring, their faces drawn and expectant, every pair of eyes a silent witness to the ancient rites of honor about to unfold. Some watched with hope, others with fear. Few trusted that peace would come from this brutal contest. I stood at the center, my hands steady despite the pounding of my heart. The rifle I'd carried was set aside. Today was a test of something older, rawer, and far more personal. The rules were clear. No weapons but skill and strength, a duel bound by the laws of the tribe and the blood of those who'd walked these lands long before me. Iona was at my side, wrapped in the worn blue-gray blanket that had become more than a simple gift, a symbol of our bond, of trust forged through hardship and sacrifice. Her eyes met mine, steady and fierce, though I could see the flicker of fear beneath her calm. This duel would decide not just my fate, but hers, and the future of the delicate peace we had begun to build. Kuruk stepped forward, his voice low and thick with anger. "If you win, you prove your place here. If you lose, you and the white woman must leave. No lies, no more shame." I nodded, swallowing the lump of tension in my throat. There was no turning back now. The elders cleared the space, their faces grave as the crowd hushed into a heavy silence. The air was thick with dust and anticipation. The first move came without warning. Kuruk lunged like a wildcat, his knife flashing in the early morning light, aimed for my side. The air whooshed past as I dodged, feeling the heat of the blade as it sliced close enough to draw blood. My fist shot out, finding his shoulder with a heavy thud, but he twisted away before I could land a second blow. The fight was brutal and unforgiving, a raw dance of survival where every strike held the weight of generations, every dodge echoed the land's ancient rhythm. Kuruk fought with the relentless fury of a man defending not just honor, but a way of life under threat. His movements were precise and fluid, shaped by a lifetime of tracking, hunting, and fighting in the unforgiving wilderness. I countered with everything I had, drawing on years of hard living on the trail. My muscles burned, my breath came ragged and sharp, but I couldn't let weakness show. The villagers watched in tense silence, the weight of their expectations pressing down like the heavy air before a storm. Blood mixed with dust, sweat stung my eyes, and time seemed to slow as the duel stretched on, each moment a test of endurance and will. Then, in a heartbeat, Kuruk faltered, a misstep on the uneven ground, a flicker of hesitation, and I saw my chance. With a surge of desperation and strength, I disarmed him, sending his knife skittering across the dirt. For a moment, the world held its breath. Kuruk's eyes burned with disbelief, fury, and then, reluctantly, respect. Slowly, I extended my hand to him, a silent offer of peace, a truce forged not in words but in the shared understanding of what had just transpired. The crowd exhaled, the tension breaking like a dam. Kuruk gripped my hand firmly, his gaze hard but not unkind. The warriors behind him relaxed, their bodies unwinding the tension of imminent battle. Iona stepped forward, her smile breaking through the worry that had shadowed her face for weeks. Her hand found mine, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of hope that transcended fear. Yet, even as the village celebrated this fragile victory, I knew the true test was far from over. The trials and the duel had proven my strength and honor, but respect was a delicate thread, easily torn by old wounds and ancient mistrust. Bridging two worlds meant more than just surviving tests or winning fights. It meant understanding histories and pain that ran deep, acknowledging that peace was not a given, but a fragile promise. In the days that followed, Iona and I worked to build trust. We shared meals by the fire, exchanged stories beneath the endless sky, and listened, truly listened, to the voices of a community caught between tradition and the encroaching future. Old wounds surfaced often. Some villagers whispered doubts behind closed doors, while others met me with cautious, guarded eyes. Kuruk became an uneasy ally, his loyalty earned through respect rather than friendship, his warnings a constant reminder that peace was a fleeting gift. One evening, as twilight painted the canyon in deep purples and golds, I found myself alone with Kuruk near the fire pit. The crackling flames flickered between us as he spoke in low tones, voice rough with experience and bitterness. "You are different from the men who came before," he said, eyes reflecting the firelight. "But this village is not your home. Remember that." His words stung, but beneath the hardness was a caution born of pain. I nodded, knowing he spoke truth as much as challenge. Iona joined us, her presence a steadying force. Together, we faced the complex web of allegiance, honor, and survival that defined this place. Each day was a negotiation, a balancing act between worlds that often seemed destined to clash. One night, beneath a sky jeweled with stars, Iona and I stood on a ridge overlooking the village. The cool wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of sage and earth. "This is only the beginning, Boone," she said softly. "Our lives are bound now, but so are the futures of our people." Her words settled deep inside me. The trials, the duel, the sacrifices, they had all led here, to a moment where the past and future hung in delicate balance. I took her hand, feeling the warmth of the blanket we shared and the weight of the promise it represented. "Whatever comes," I said, voice steady despite the turmoil inside, "I will stand with you, not just for today, but for all the days to come." She smiled, a fierce light in her eyes. "Then we walk this path together." As the night deepened, I understood the truth of those words. In this land carved by fire and ice, the greatest battles were fought not with guns or knives, but with hearts brave enough to heal, and souls willing to change. The road ahead would be long, filled with trials no less daunting than those we'd faced so far. But as I looked out over the village, now resting under a blanket of stars, I knew that whatever shadow lay ahead, we would face it side by side. Because sometimes, the hardest fight is not for survival, but for hope. The air hung heavy with the scent of smoke and pine as the sun sank behind the towering canyon walls, painting the sky in blood-red and gold. Our village, nestled like a fragile jewel in the heart of the wilderness, had grown quieter, but beneath the calm was a restless undercurrent, a feeling that the peace we fought to build was as delicate as the fading light. Iona and I had spent countless hours in the days since the duel, weaving threads of understanding between the ancient customs of her people and the harsh truths of my own. But the deeper we dug, the more I realized how vast the gulf was, how much history, fear, and pain were tangled up in this land. The villagers no longer saw me as just an outsider. Some called me husband, others whispered words of doubt and caution. Kuruk's presence was a constant reminder of the simmering tension, a warrior bound by tradition but increasingly reluctant to wield his knife against me. His grudging respect was earned but fragile, as brittle as the desert soil after a rare rain. One evening, as dusk wrapped the village in a velvet hush, Iona and I found ourselves alone near the river, the water's gentle murmur soothing the weight in my chest. "I want you to know," she said softly, eyes reflecting the moonlight, "my people carry stories. Stories of loss and survival, betrayal and hope. And you're coming. It stirs something old." I nodded, feeling the weight of those stories settle inside me. "I never meant to bring trouble. Only to help." Her fingers found mine, warm and steady. Help can mean many things here. It can bind, it can break, it can heal, or it can destroy. Her words echoed in the silence that followed, heavy with meaning. Days turned into weeks. The village slowly returned to a rhythm, children playing, elders teaching, fires burning against the night chill. Yet the shadow of what was to come lingered. The trials had proven more than my strength. They had challenged my very understanding of honor and belonging. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the distant ridge, a lone figure silhouetted against the sun. As he drew closer, the familiar crest of the trading post's messenger became clear. With his arrival came news that rippled through the village like a stone tossed into still water. The world beyond the canyon was shifting. The U.S. Army was moving closer, rumors of forced relocation and broken treaties spreading like wildfire. The fragile peace we had fought for was now threatened by the iron fist of outsiders who cared little for customs or lives tied to the land. Kuruk's eyes darkened as he listened to the news, his hand unconsciously resting on the hilt of his knife. The older warriors gathered, their faces etched with worry and resolve. The villagers' laughter faded, replaced by quiet discussions and urgent plans. Iona pulled me aside. "This changes everything," she whispered. "The outside world doesn't understand our ways. They won't honor the bonds we've made." I swallowed hard, feeling the chill of inevitability. "Then we'll face it together, whatever comes." That night, the village elders convened beneath the ancient oak in the center of the village, the flickering firelight casting long shadows on weathered faces. I was called to join, a gesture both surprising and weighty. Nalnish, Iona's grandfather, spoke with the authority of a man who had seen too much loss. "The white man has come before, bringing promises and death in the same breath. Our people must decide if this stranger among us is a bridge or a threat." All eyes turned to me. The silence was suffocating, the judgment palpable. I raised my voice, steady despite the knot in my stomach. "I didn't come here to bring war. I came to help, to understand, to stand with you." Some nodded, others remained wary. Kuruk's voice cut through, low and grave. "Words can be wind. The land speaks louder. We must be ready." The days that followed were tense. Training began. The villagers prepared for what might come, not just with weapons, but with knowledge, unity, and an unbreakable will. Iona stood by my side, a fierce beacon of strength and hope. Together, we navigated the precarious path between fear and faith. One evening, beneath a sky heavy with stars, I found myself at the edge of the village, staring into the darkness beyond. Memories of the first time I'd wrapped that blanket around Iona's shoulders came rushing back. The moment kindness became a bond heavier than I could have imagined. I realized then that this story was far from over. It was a story of survival, of love tested by fire, and of two worlds bound by threads stronger than blood. The journey ahead would be brutal, uncertain, and fraught with sacrifice. But as I turned back toward the village, toward Iona and the people who had become my family, I knew this truth. Some bonds cannot be broken. Some promises must be honored, no matter the cost. Because in the end, it is not the weapons we carry, but the courage we hold in our hearts that shapes our destiny. The morning sun spilled gold over the canyon rim, its light warming the cold earth as the village awoke to an uneasy stillness. We all knew what day it was. The whispers had long turned to murmurs, the murmurs to tense silence. The inevitable reckoning was near. I felt it in the tightening of every muscle, in the quickened beats of my heart, and in Iona's firm grip on my arm. The trading post messenger's warning had rippled through our lives like an approaching storm. The U.S. Army was advancing, their intent unmistakable. They came with orders to remove, to relocate, to erase the traditions and lives that had flourished in these canyons for centuries. This was a battle for survival not just of bodies, but of spirit, identity, and honor. Kuruk stood on the edge of the village clearing, surrounded by a circle of warriors. His eyes, once fiery with personal challenge, now burned with grim resolve. No longer was he an adversary to me. He was a protector of his people, and I could feel his silent demand that I prove my loyalty beyond mere words. Iona's hand tightened around mine as we watched the soldiers crest the ridge. Their boots kicked up dust, their rifles gleaming harshly in the sun. The clash was no longer abstract. It was here. The elders had gathered us, not to fight but to negotiate, to plead for peace. I was chosen to speak, the bridge between two worlds, the man who carried the blanket of promise and the weight of new responsibility. Stepping forward, I faced the soldier's captain, a stern man whose face was carved with years of orders and duty. Words passed between us, measured, cautious, but with the ever-present undercurrent of threat. The captain spoke of treaties, of government mandates, of progress. Yet beneath the rhetoric, I saw the brutal reality, the erasure of a people. Returning to the village, I relayed what I had learned. The elders conferred, voices low and urgent. Some spoke of surrender to spare lives, others of resistance to preserve honor. The choice was a knife edge. That night, as fires burned in the center of the village, Iona and I sat beneath the stars, the cool air heavy with unspoken fears. "This is more than a fight for land," she whispered. "It is a fight for our very souls." I nodded, feeling the depth of her truth. And whatever happens, we stand together. The following dawn was thick with tension. The villagers, men and women alike, prepared silently. The warriors sharpened weapons, while others readied supplies. Children were hidden away, their innocent faces a stark contrast to the battle lines forming around them. Kuruk approached me, his face shadowed by the morning light. "You have proven strength and honor, Boone. But this will test all of us. Be ready." The hours that followed blurred into a whirlwind of activity. Scouts reported the soldiers' approach. Plans were whispered and debated. The weight of impending conflict pressed down on every breath. Then, the moment came. The soldiers advanced toward the village, their rifles raised, their commands cutting through the stillness like thunder. The villagers formed their lines, not just warriors, but elders and women standing firm, united by a shared destiny. I stood beside Iona, her eyes fierce and unyielding. The battle was no longer between tribes or men. It was between worlds clashing with the force of history and the desperation of survival. The first volley of shots shattered the morning calm. Smoke curled upward as the fight erupted with savage intensity. I moved through the chaos, heart pounding, every instinct screaming for survival and protection. Kuruk fought beside me, his blade flashing, his voice rising in fierce battle cries. The warriors moved with the rhythm of the land, using every advantage the canyon offered. But the soldiers pressed forward relentlessly, their numbers and weapons overwhelming. Amid the roar of gunfire and shouts, I saw Iona tending to the wounded, her hands steady despite the terror. She was the heart of the village, a beacon of hope amid the carnage. As the sun climbed higher, the tide of battle shifted again and again. Losses were suffered on both sides, the earth stained with blood and dust. The canyon echoed with the cries of pain and the prayers of those fighting to protect all they held dear. At one moment, I found myself face to face with the captain. His eyes met mine, no longer just enemy and outsider, but two men caught in a brutal dance dictated by forces beyond their control. We fought with raw desperation, each strike a plea for survival. I saw the captain falter, and in that instant, chose mercy over vengeance. Lowering my weapon, I extended a hand. The gesture shocked him, but he hesitated, and then accepted. The battle slowed, the violence waning as understanding flickered in hardened eyes. When the smoke cleared, the price was painfully clear. Lives lost, dreams shattered, but a fragile hope remained. In the aftermath, Iona and I stood amidst the broken earth and grieving faces. The village was battered but unbroken. The soldiers, too, had paid a heavy toll. It was clear then that the path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and heartache. But it was also clear that violence was not the end, that bridges could be built from the ashes of war. The elders convened again, their voices weary but resolute. A new treaty was forged, one that demanded respect and recognition, hard-won and fragile as glass. Iona and I, bound by more than just the blanket now, vowed to walk this new road together, to be the bridge between cultures, the voice of peace in a world too often torn by conflict. As the sun set behind the canyon, painting the sky with fire and hope, I understood that this was only the beginning of a story about courage, sacrifice, and the power of understanding. Because sometimes, the greatest battles are fought not with weapons, but with hearts willing to change. The dawn broke slow and tentative over the jagged canyon walls, light filtering through the haze like a fragile promise. The village lay quiet, bearing the weight of yesterday's battle in every scarred tree, every shattered stone. The air was thick with a silence born not of peace, but of exhaustion, grief, and the fragile hope that survival had gifted us. I stood at the edge of the village, the early light catching the folds of the blue and grey blanket draped over my shoulders, the same one I had given Iona months ago, a symbol that had become so much more. The wool felt heavier now, saturated with memories, sacrifices, and the threads of a bond one never could have imagined. Iona appeared beside me, her face pale but resolute. Her eyes, dark and steady, held the weight of a people's history and the fragile dream of a future that might finally be ours to shape. For the first time since our paths crossed, I saw not just the girl who had nearly frozen to death in the snow, but the woman who carried her ancestors' strength and the hope of generations yet to come. She reached out, fingers brushing the blanket where it hung between us, a silent affirmation that this bond was no longer just a binding of two souls, but a bridge between worlds. Our village was scarred but alive, the community shaken yet unbroken. Faces that had once held suspicion now glimmered with cautious acceptance. The battle had been brutal, too many had fallen, and the land itself seemed to mourn with us. But in the ashes, something new had taken root, understanding. The elders gathered in the center of the village beneath the great oak, the ancient sentinel that had watched over our people for centuries. Their voices were softer now, tempered by the shared pain and the knowledge that the world beyond the canyon was changing faster than any of us could control. Nalnish, Iona's grandfather, stood with a quiet dignity that spoke louder than words. His weathered face bore the marks of a lifetime's wisdom and loss. He addressed the crowd, his voice steady yet laden with the gravity of what we had endured. We have walked through fire and ice, he said, his eyes sweeping the gathered faces. We have faced death and despair, but still we stand. The blanket that once was a simple shield against the cold has become a symbol of our resilience. It binds us, not just as husband and wife, but as people united by respect and courage. Kuruk, standing tall despite the loss, nodded in agreement. His rivalry with me had transformed into a complicated respect forged in battle and shared pain. The divisions that once threatened to tear us apart now seemed to blur beneath the weight of a common cause. I stepped forward, feeling the eyes of the village upon me, the responsibility of my words as heavy as the wool on my shoulders. This land, these people, have taught me more about honor and strength than any gunfight ever could, I said. The traditions you protect are not relics of the past, but the roots of our future. I came here a stranger, seeking to do a simple kindness. What I found was a family, a cause greater than myself. And I vow to stand with you, now and always. Iona smiled then, a rare, radiant light that broke through the shadow of hardship. We are stronger because we face this together, she said. Not as enemies, not as strangers, but as one. In the days that followed, the village began to heal. The U.S. Army, recognizing the cost and the resolve of the people here, retreated for the time being, leaving a tenuous peace in their wake. It was not the end of our struggles, but a moment to breathe and rebuild. Iona and I worked side by side, bridging gaps, teaching, learning. I learned the stories behind the symbols carved into the leather pouch Nalnish had given me, the stories of bravery, sacrifice, and the sacred connection to the land. She learned the ways of my world, the laws and customs that shaped my past, seeking understanding rather than judgment. We became storytellers, weaving together the threads of two cultures to create a tapestry stronger than either alone. The blanket remained a symbol, not just of marriage, but of unity, compassion, and the courage to face the unknown. One afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows over the canyon floor, Iona and I stood at the edge of the river, watching the water carve its endless path through rock and earth. It's like the river, she said softly, always moving, always changing. Sometimes it crashes through obstacles, sometimes it flows gently around them. But it never stops. I nodded. And like the river, we find our way, not alone, but together. Her hand found mine again, warm and steady. As the seasons changed, the village grew stronger. New faces arrived, travelers, traders, seekers of peace, drawn by the story of the white man who honored the customs of the Apache and the woman who dared to bridge worlds. The story of the blanket spread beyond the canyon, a legend of kindness turned covenant, a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts carry the greatest weight. At night, beneath the vast sky, I often thought back to that cold day when I had wrapped that worn blanket around a shivering girl. I could never have imagined then the journey it would set in motion, of battles fought, of hearts changed, and of a future reborn. The legacy of that blanket was no longer mine alone. It belonged to the people of this land, to Iona and her ancestors, and to all who believe that understanding can conquer fear. And as I lay beneath the stars, the wind whispering through the canyon pines, I knew one truth above all. The warmth we seek is not just in wool or fire, but in the bonds we choose to forge, the promises we keep, and the courage to stand together, no matter the cold that may come. If you were in his shoes, would you fight the same battle? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, and explore the other videos waiting for you on screen.